Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. In last week's session, we navigated our way, hands lashed to the wheel, into the harbour of Chapter 10, but we beached ourselves before we could really finish, so we're going to pick up from that. This week, we saw already the worsening of Lucy Westenra's condition. We saw the first transfusion of blood, this time from Arthur. More of that will be forthcoming. And this week, we're going to basically get a lot of the same. Before moving on to darker tidings, our first real glimpse of Dracula in England, to devilry and hopelessness, the curious case of the wolf in the nighttime, and a farewell to the ladies Westenra. All that and more in the next, I'm going to say like an hour, but let's be real, it's probably going to be a little more than that, because before we get started, I have here a quick question from the wonderful Angela, who listened to last week's show and had some clarifying questions about the Demeter and the fate of the crew thereof. Angela writes, quote, "The first mate tells the captain he stabbed the stranger with his knife and it passed right through him. Is this proof that the figure seen on deck is not, as you speculated last week, the real Dracula, but rather a vision? How does the captain know to bind his hands to the wheel with the crucifix? How does he know it will protect him from Dracula?" Angela, these are excellent questions, and I think it does behoove us at this point to consider the fate of the Demeter, because we're going to get into some areas in this week's reading, more so I would say than really anywhere else in the novel, where we're going to be actively encouraged to speculate about Dracula's capabilities, right? About his power set. And I want to be careful and attentive as we do that, to look no further than the text, right? Just to follow the instruction, the specificity of the text itself. So let's, and I will acknowledge too, I suppose, with that said and with that in mind, that I did perhaps dip a little into the lore of vampires last week. I maybe got myself a little swayed by the century of vampire fiction that followed in the wake of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and didn't perhaps pay sufficiently close attention to the text as it's presented to us. Because the most straightforward literal explanation, the Occam's razor of textual interpretation, I suppose, is that Dracula's influence over the crew leads them to leap to their deaths one by one. We have no concrete reason to believe that he ever leaves his crate physically, right? There are glimpses of him, of course, on deck, but no reason to believe that he physically leaves his crate at any point during the journey. I speculated a little last week that perhaps he had to feed and kind of built this causal chain coming out from there. Well, okay, if we accept as an actual fact that he is physically absent from his crate at one or more times through the course of the voyage, then everything else becomes a cover-up. But I'm just not sure that that's true. And we're certainly going to be able to tie what happens to the crew of the Demeter together with what happens to Lucy as we move toward the end of tonight's reading. Let's take a quick look specifically at a slide that I skipped over last week in my haste to be done last week. We slipped over the slide of what the first mate actually saw. This is from, of course, the captain's log of the Demeter. Quote, "It is nearly all over now. Just as I was beginning to hope that the mate would come out calmer, for I heard him knocking away at something in the hold, and work is good for him. There came up the hatchway a sudden startled scream, which made my blood run cold, and up on the deck he came as if shot from a gun, a raging madman, with his eyes rolling and his face convulsed with fear. 'Save me! Save me!' he cried, and then looked round on the blanket of fog. His horror turned to despair, and in a steady voice he said, 'You'd better come to, Captain, before it's too late. He's there. I know the secret now. The sea will save me from him, and it is all that is left.' Before I could say a word or move forward to seize him, he sprang on the bulwark and deliberately threw himself into the sea." So what happens? We know that he goes down into the hold of the ship with this is when, by the way, there's only the first mate and the captain left alive on the Demeter. He goes down into the hold with this resolution to unscrew the crates and to find out what they contain. He beholds Dracula in his crate, presumably, and flees into the embrace of the sea. And given that we don't have here any textual evidence to the contrary, I think the smartest thing that we can do here as readers is assume that it is this same influence, one way or another, this same belief that the sea holds a refuge, which the captain also echoes in his closing moments, that leads to the deaths of the other sailors. And we do have a little bit of textual support for this, I suppose, because we can consider what happened to Jonathan Harker back in Castle Dracula when he also uncovers Dracula. You know, this is the leech-like corpulent Dracula, having recently fed. And as he moves through the fear, Harker resolves to end Dracula in that moment with the aid of the blade of his shovel, but there is something that happens, right? Dracula ambiguously turns to look at him, and Harker is defeated in his purpose. Is that what happened here? Is it the same kind of influence? Is Dracula conscious in that moment or not? Well, frankly, it's impossible to unpick from the textual evidence that we have, but we can at least see a commonality between these two events. So last week, as I said, I speculated that Dracula needed to feed aboard the ship and then had to cover up the fact that he needed to feed aboard the ship. But I'm not certain that that's the case. I made the mistake, the classic error, if you will, of assuming that Dracula's powers are like the abilities codified on a Dungeons and Dragons character sheet, or like the abilities submenu of your favorite video game, right? That he has 3 uses a day of pass through inanimate object, up to 10 feet of material can be passed in a mist-like trace. And I just don't think that is how Stoker is thinking about Dracula at this point, and certainly not how this novel, this epistolary novel, with all of its various viewpoints, is leading us to view Dracula and to view these events. I don't think it's trying to give us these clean, concise answers. And the influence of Dracula doesn't seem to be entirely under his control. And again, we have a trace of textual evidence for this, right? The textual evidence that Dracula exerts a psychic influence around him, some kind of malign, miasmatic influence around him, right? We've seen that before. We've seen that in Castle Dracula. We've seen the surroundings of Castle Dracula. We have seen his presence poison and taint that land and create this influence, this culture of superstition and fear in the locals surrounding him, right? This is not a land in which Dracula is passing without a trace, which is, as we know now, something that he really badly wants to do. So what benefit is there to Dracula if the locals a day's ride in any direction from Castle Dracula are suspicious of him and know that something foul is in the wind and know to protect each other with crucifixes and what is it, mountain ash and garlic and so on and so forth, right? There's no benefit to him from that. It seems, in fact, that is one of the things that he is fleeing from the old world to the new, right? He is looking for the anonymity of modernity, yes, but he's also looking for an erasure of this influence, which I do think is thematically incredibly rich, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. For now, let us consider this, as I said, miasmatic evil, right? This idea that there is a cloud of evil around the Count. It's not a power that he possesses. It is simply a consequence of his existence that he cannot help but be felt, can't help but darken and sway the minds of those around him, particularly suggestible minds, right? Minds like Renfield. Well, Renfield's an easy example there. He is very suggestible. He falls under Dracula's sway at a great distance, absolutely. Also, though, minds like Lucy, who Mina carefully describes as, quote, Lucy is so sweet and sensitive that she feels influences more acutely than other people do. So there is a measure here of, obviously, particularly as we look at Dracula's pursuit of Lucy, there is a conscious strategy here, right? He is testing out these various plans to get to Lucy Westenra, but there also seems to be an influence over her that he is not completely in control of. So is it possible that he knows this? Is it possible that this is part of his desire to travel anonymously? Is it possible that he knew from the jump that the crew of the Demeter would fall under the sway of his presence and that he would have to either murder them or lead them to their deaths in order to preserve that anonymity? Well, again, we don't know for sure, but in the absence of other information, I think it's a pretty strong thread of interpretation and speculation in equal measure. Not only is it difficult for us to build an explanation for Dracula's remote influence on the crewmen of the Demeter, right? Mr. Swales, who I didn't even mention in that last group of influenceable minds. Sure, influenceable is a word. More notably, Renfield, of course. There is this thematic resonance, right? Because we're in 1897, and really we're in the 1890s as a kind of as a blur, right? We're kind of, because it takes Stoker so long to write this novel, we are in effect kind of absorbing the zeitgeist of the 1890s. And we have to remember that there's an interesting tension in the 1890s between this miasmatic view of plague and illness, right? The previous version of science, I suppose, to kind of stain that word with far too broad a definition. But it was previously thought that diseases were carried by bad air, that they were carried by foul smells. This is what the miasma is, right? And it is only in 1890 that Robert Koch basically comes up with the theory of modern bacteriological disease infection, right? It's in this period. I think it's not even until 1895, perhaps, that the first virus is identified. It's somewhere very shortly before the release of Dracula that the first virus is identified, and we move from this miasmatic theory of disease that has stood for centuries, right, into a modern bacteriological, virological understanding of what disease is, which means that if we're inclined to see thematic tension here, we might easily discern the familiar shapes of the old versus the new, the modern versus the ancient, the rational versus the supernatural, the irrational, if you like. As the captain of the Demeter, well, there's a lot to talk about there, isn't there? Because for all that we get this fantastic account from him, we don't know that much about him. A certain amount is communicated, but for example, we don't know whether or not he is Russian. We assume that he is because the Demeter is a Russian vessel and all but the first mate, the captain possibly excluded, are Russian too. But we don't know. And I'm not sure in this final moment, in the final moment of his life, whether or not Dracula emerges from his crate and rushes onto the deck and that he is really confronted. He talks about the stare of this thing, of it, but I don't know for sure, or if this is just the influence being magnified by the stress upon the poor man's mind. Also, it's worth noting, just so that we can be specific in our reference here, he doesn't bind his hands to the helm with the crucifix, but rather with cords. I pulled the quote here. The man was simply fastened by his hands, tied one over the other to the spoke of the wheel. Between the inner hand and the wood was a crucifix. The set of beads on it fastened around both wrists and wheel, and all kept fast by the binding cords. So he is bound by these ropes, but also interwoven with the ropes is the crucifix itself. Interestingly, the crucifix, of course, as distinct from the cross in Christian symbolism because of the presence of the body of Christ, usually, particularly in the Western tradition, and I think that this is just technically true by any definition, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm woefully undereducated in this area, as I am in so many, in fact. But I believe that for it to be a real crucifix in the Western tradition, it has to have an actual sculptural element. It has to, have the little metal figure of Christ upon the crucifix. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, which would include the Russian Orthodox tradition, that is a little looser, and the figure of Jesus himself can just be painted sometimes upon the cross there. So it's possible that he has a relatively small wooden cross buried in his fist there, just held tight between, crucially, the fist and the wheel. So it is really bound with all of his strength in addition to the ropes there. So how did he know the crucifix would protect him? I mean, there's 1,000 years of Christian storytelling mythology, Christian dogma, in effect, that says that the crucifix is a protective symbol, that says that the crucifix will guard you from evil of any kind, right? And we're not yet in a modern era here where we want to very carefully distinguish the schools and domains and particular vulnerabilities of these monsters, right? All of this stuff will be codified later, like garlic for vampires and silver for werewolves and all of these things. But here it's just a little looser, right? Dracula is just evil. So the crucifix would presumably protect against it. I don't know whether the captain is certain of that, or whether this is just a measure of his faith. He certainly expresses it as boldly as he can, right? Specifically that the creature, that it dare not touch it. We're not sure where that faith comes from. We're not sure how aware he is of what's really happening. We're not sure which stories he is sensitive to, right? We're not sure how familiar he is with the Romanian mythology of, well, vampires in general, we might speculate, but certainly Dracula in particular, which the first mate seems to be. That would account for his increased violence, his increased hostility, his increased aggression as things are becoming darker on the Demeter through the first part of its voyage. Though also, we might speculate that that is just the first mate falling more deeply under this miasmatic influence of Dracula than the other crewmen? Are you more informed because you're Romanian, or are you more susceptible because you are Romanian, or are you, very interestingly, possibly both, right? There's so many ways in which Stoker throughout this novel kind of anticipates the next move in Gothic horror, which is the cosmic horror, right? Stoker is anticipating a lot of what we're going to get from Lovecraft 20 years later. And I think that that's a really interesting bit of foreshadowing. If we're already tying together these ideas that knowledge is dangerous in and of itself, that part of the appeal of Victorian rationality, part of the appeal of the kinds of justification and rationalization that we will see from Mina Harker and from John Seward and from so many other characters through the course of tonight's reading in particular, right? Basically, everyone apart from Van Helsing. Part of the appeal of that rationalization is that it keeps you safe. Like, literally keeps you safe, as well as offering you comfort. To acknowledge the danger of the world out there would be to sleep uneasily for the rest of your life. Thank you so much, Angela, for those questions. I hope that I answered at least part of it, right? At least part of it. Presumably it is also the opening of the crate by the first mate that compels Dracula to flee from the ship in the form of the dog, right? Because he has to wait. We are clearly, and this is partly the reason that I think that Dracula physically is never, in fact, aboard the deck of the Demeter, right? Is that he seems very nervous about the open water. When the ship arrives in Whitby, he waits for the ship to literally beach itself, then, transformed into the form of the dog, leaps from the bow onto the sand. So he is not at any point coming into contact with the seawater, and there are, of course, old traditions about running water and seawater being the bane of the vampiric sort. So it's possible also that we're leaning into something there, but I'm not sure that he leaps from the bow onto the shore, ascends the East Cliff, frightens Mr. Swales to death, and then presumably tucks into the grave of the suicide that's there beneath the bench for a good night's sleep. It's a pretty grim first day in England, but by no means the worst, I'm sure. As I was saying, thank you, Angela, so much for that question. If you guys have other questions, because this is a pretty labyrinthine text, and we have, for all that it has taken us 6 weeks to make it halfway through this novel, we have been moving pretty quickly. So if you have questions, if you have thoughts, certainly if you have comments, if you have, please, clarifications, please do get in touch at starsandswordspod@gmail.com, or you can head on over to Stars and Swords. Yes, to starsandswords.com, in fact, is the name of the website that I built. And you can use the handy-dandy contact form to get in touch and let me know your thoughts. All of that said, then, we have spent, good Lord, almost 20 minutes on last week's episode. Let's get into this week's episode. We've got a lot to cover. Let's look at the aftermath of transfusion and Lucy's strange wounds. Quote, "When Arthur had gone, I went back to the room. Lucy was sleeping gently, but her breathing was stronger. I could see the counterpane move as her breast heaved. By the bedside sat Van Helsing, looking at her intently. The velvet band again covered the red mark. I asked the professor in a whisper, 'What do you make of that mark on her throat?' 'What do you make of it?' 'I have not seen it yet,' I answered, and then and there proceeded to loose the band. Just over the external jugular vein there were 2 punctures, not large, but not wholesome looking. There was no sign of disease, but the edges were white and worn looking, as if by some trituration. It at once occurred to me that this wound, or whatever it was, might have been the means of that manifest loss of blood. But I abandoned that idea as soon as formed, for such a thing could not be. The whole bed would have been drenched to a scarlet with the blood that the girl must have lost to leave such a pallor as she had before the transfusion." "Well," said Van Helsing. "Well," said I can make nothing of it." I mentioned previously the clutches that we make toward rational explanations here in this week's reading, and we're starting strong here with Dr. Seward. Oh my God, she has these little blood-like pinpricks on her neck. That could explain the giant loss of blood that she's experienced, but obviously not. So therefore, there is no explanation. Therefore, I am at a complete loss. He cannot acknowledge the thing which he cannot acknowledge, right? He is bound by the rationality that preserves him. And I'm going to continue, I think, to beat the drum in the defense of rationality within the pages of this book. Stoker does not think that rationality is a bad thing. He's not making fun of Seward here. What he's doing is pointing out its incompatibility with the mystery of the world, the fact that it is itself insufficient, right? Rationality is not a bad thing. Rationality will, spoilers for the end of the book, eventually save the day. But between here and there, we are going to have to learn to leaven that rationality with a certain measure of wisdom, right? Relying, as Van Helsing urged Seward in last week's reading, to rely on our intelligence more than our memories. Don't be hidebound by what we have learned already. Don't be hidebound by what we believe to be possible. Use your intelligence. Really look at the world in front of you, because that will reveal the full magnitude of its mystery. So I will note here, too, that this is going to be our last, I think, very dense week of reading, assuming that I can make it all the way to the end of Lucy in tonight's reading. That's going to be our last very dense week, because the last half of this book, the second half of this book, is, I think, a little looser and not quite as strong, not quite as dense, not quite as intentional as the first half of the book. But it is important to note right here that we're seeing a modulation of tone. It's a very skillful modulation of tone, but it modulates in two ways. One is into a kind of horror mystery. What on earth is happening to Lucy? And it's difficult for modern readers to maybe be caught up in that story completely, right? Because we know what's happening to Lucy. We knew what was happening to Lucy from the jump. We knew what was happening to Lucy before we opened the book. So it's hard to sink into that narrative, particularly because the narrative isn't constructed for us, right? We're not given a dynamic first-person account. We're given these epistolary documents. We're giving this collection of archival material that allows us to infer the story ourselves, but without a hand to guide us and propel us through the story. It's lacking in a certain immediacy, a certain narrative immediacy for the modern reader. But at the same time, I think this part of the book is saved by the enormous depth of emotion that we get. I still think that Stoker is an incredible writer, and we're going to get some stuff tonight that I think is really genuinely very touching and very powerful. And not just from Lucy, not just from Mina, but from Van Helsing, from Seward. You know, I think this is a very well-written section. But we're also leaning a little bit on that procedural development, right? We're looking at what would be on CBS a 15-part season that would I guess they don't run 15-part seasons on CBS. It would be an 8-episode HBO miniseries, right? Because we've got something that we can milk now to generate stories for a few episodes. We're going to have this very sawtooth repeating structure, as we've already established with Lucy. So, to get into that here, the first transfusion quickly undoes the harm done to Lucy. Partly, we might infer, because of the quality of Arthur's noble blood, right? I'm not sure how much this is Stoker's intent, but if you track the efficacy of each subsequent transfusion, it declines. And I'm not sure that it's intentional that we decline from the nobility to the commonest man, right? We go all the way down to Quincy Morris there at the end. I'm not sure that that's what Stoker is getting at, more than he is getting at the increasingly malign influence of Dracula himself. But it is odd that that is our progression, right? Like the blood of Arthur is incredibly efficacious in terms of restoring Lucy to her health and well-being. You know, Seward somewhat less so, Van Helsing somewhat less so, Quincy Morris really not that much at all, in fact. We've got here, let me see. Let me advance this slide so that we can get into Van Helsing's next account. He performs the second transfusion. He gives Lucy Seward's blood. This is by September 9th. This again restores her health and vigor less completely than before. Seward rests. Van Helsing orders this emergency shipment of garlic flowers from Amsterdam to London. They arrive and he drapes the room in the flowers. Lucy protests that they are just common garlic, and Van Helsing responds with this fairly great monologue here. To my surprise, Van Helsing rose up and said with all his sternness, his iron jaw set and his bushy eyebrows meeting, "No trifling with me. I never jest. There is grim purpose in all I do, and I warn you, you do not thwart me. Take care for the sake of others, if not your own." Then, seeing poor Lucy scared, as she might well be, he went on more gently, "Oh, little miss, my dear, do not fear me. I only do for your good, but there is much virtue to you in these so common flowers. See, I place them myself in your room. I make myself the wreath that you are to wear. But hush, no telling to others that make so inquisitive questions. We must obey, and silence is a part of obedience. And obedience is to bring you strong and well into loving arms that wait for you. Now, sit still a while. Come with me, friend John. You shall have me deck the room with my garlic, which is all the way from Haarlem, where my friend Vanderpool raised urban glass houses all the year. I had to telegraph yesterday, or they would not have been here." Modernity, right? Raising herbs in a glass house all year round, being able to ship them overnight from Haarlem to London. This is impressive stuff. This is, the swift industrial machine at work. But what we also see here is, for all that Van Helsing stands as a counterpoint to the other men of the novel, because he is not so hidebound by his Victorian rationality. He is not so hidebound by his prejudice, right? He is not so hidebound by his constraint and limited imagination. He is still an embodiment of that kind of professional and peculiarly academic authority that we see throughout the Victorian era. This, I think, is really lovely. The argument that we must obey, and silence is a part of obedience, and obedience is to bring you strong and well into the loving arms that wait for you. I think that Stoker really does manage to, while dealing with the clumsy English as a second language qualities of Van Helsing's writing, he really does manage to convey both the sternness, the grimness, and the gentleness, both of which will be in full effect as we conclude tonight's reading, of course. So Van Helsing departs. Lucy notes in her diary before she sleeps, I should say Van Helsing and Seward depart. So confident are they in the efficacy of the garlic in Lucy's bedroom. They depart. Lucy notes in her diary that she is grateful for their friendship. We can read in that excerpt, in fact, that she is already feeling the influence of the garlic, right? She's already feeling more restful. She's already feeling more peaceful. She's able to acknowledge very distantly some of the things that she has been experiencing, but now they have no hold on her. She is ready to sleep. Unfortunately, the 13th of September, we return only to discover that Lucy's mother, who has been deliberately kept in the dark about everything that's happening, by the way, just in order to preserve her health and well-being, took the flowers away in the night and opened the windows. Van Helsing breaks before they even see what's become of Lucy. I find this such a fascinating moment here. This is Seward observing. Before we have seen Lucy, right, we just learn that the garlic has been taken away and the window has been opened. Van Helsing knows exactly what has happened before he sees it. Then, for the first time in my life, I saw Van Helsing break down. He raised his hands over his head in a sort of mute despair and then beat his palms together in a helpless way. Finally, he sat down on a chair and, putting his hands before his face, began to sob with loud, dry sobs that seemed to come from the very racking of his heart. Then he raised his arms again as though appealing to the whole universe. God, 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 he said. What have we done? What has this poor thing done that we are so sore beset? Is there fate amongst us still set down from the pagan world of old that such things must be and in such way? This poor mother, all unknowing and all for the best as she think, does such thing as lose her daughter body and soul. And we must not tell her, we must not even warn her, or she die, and then both die. Oh, how are we beset? How are all the powers of the devils against us? Suddenly, he jumped to his feet. Come, he said, come, we must see and act. Devils or no devils, or all the devils at once, it matters not. We must fight him all the same. A fantastic moment of grief and resolution from Van Helsing there. A real appeal to the heavens? Yes, right. Like a direct appeal to God. There's no ambiguity there, right? It's a direct appeal to God. God, 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 what have we done? What has this poor thing done that we are so sore beset? Is there fate amongst us still, sent down from the pagan world of old, that such things must be and in such way? Have we not, God, have we not, in our worship of you, in our construction of the modern world, have we not rid ourselves, freed ourselves, liberated ourselves from these supernatural things that haunt us, from these darknesses of the pagan world, right? He's not saying for a moment, Dracula's not real, vampires aren't real, there are no shadows in the pagan world. He's beset by the idea that though we have created this magnificent civilization, the pinnacle of civilization, right? Though we have accomplished all of this, are we still to be beset in the old ways by the shadows that haunted our pagan forebears? And it doesn't matter, is the answer, right? This emotional turn here is, an emotional turn that I think many of us have experienced over the course of the last few weeks, particularly those of us here in the United States. This moment of grief. Oh, how we are beset. Here come all the powers of the devils against us. And then he does this Van Helsing turn. It's this same kind of ability to move between one emotional state and the next with enormous agility and speed, with enormous alacrity, right? He just is suddenly then resolved. He has his big feeling, he lets it out of his body, and now he is ready. Not because that feeling is spent, but because it is being turned into action. Come, he said, come, we must see and act. Devils or no devils or all the devils at once, it matters not. We must fight him all the same. That him there is, of course, very interesting. I would take that, honestly. I think if you are dogmatically minded. We might consider this, the great adversary. We might consider this, Satan, the devil. We might consider this some kind of mythological figure, that this evil, perhaps. But I don't see that in what Van Helsing is saying here, not least of all because that he, and this is obviously Stoker's interposition as the architect of these created documents, right? But there is no capital H there, as we might expect if he was referring to something larger in power and in scope than the vampire Dracula. But nonetheless, he is resolved, right? Devils or no devils, all the devils at once, it matters not, we must fight him all the same. No devils is a really interesting inclusion there too. Even if nothing is wrong, we have to fight him. Even if there is no great evil besetting us right now, we still have to fight. There is still this valorous desire for work in the Victorian heart, right? I didn't even mention that back when we were looking at that the slide discussing the fate of the first mate, right? The captain notes, I just let him go down into the hold and start banging away at those crates because, actually work is good for him and this might really help him. Even here, as they are the last two men alive on the Demeter, he's still thinking, well, work is the thing. Work is what he should be doing right now. And I think we see a little bit of that here from Van Helsing, but it's not work in the same sense, right? It's not the menial work of hands and shoulders and back. It is the work of mind and heart. It is the constant desire to improve. It is the constant desire to build not specific structures, but societies, right? To build our cities themselves rather than just the individual buildings. I find this, as you can tell by the fact that I'm using this quote for the title of this week's session, I find this enormously powerful. So we discover Lucy looking drawn again, and a third transfusion, has to be performed. This time, the blood from Van Helsing himself. Then on September 17th, Lucy writes about, again, feeling much better, continuing this sawtooth narrative structure, right? We're building a lot of tension, I'm sure, for the contemporary reader, but it does perhaps feel a little repetitive for the modern reader because we know where it's going. And we cut out from there to the cutting from the Pall Mall Gazette, a real newspaper which was launched in February of 1865 and ran until 1921, where it merged with an older print newspaper in London, The Globe, which would itself be turned into a part of the DNA of the venerable Evening Standard, right? A journalistic institution in London for almost 2 centuries. The Evening Standard was published daily in London from 1827 until September of this year. Just another part of our print heritage, our journalistic heritage, also falling by the wayside there. So we get our... I should note that the Evening Standard has been transformed into a weekly publication called the London Standard, which is apparently not meeting with a lot of success in the streets of London. The Evening Standard, a famously and wildly controversial publication over the course of its last 20 years, and I would go more into that, but I do not have time to do it, and this isn't Newspaper History with Alistair Stevens. We get instead this account from our intrepid reporter who ventures to the zoological gardens. This is presumably the real-life London Zoo, the London Zoological Gardens, also known sometimes as the Regent's Park Zoo. These are all the same institution. The oldest scientific zoo, the oldest research zoo in the world, in fact, established in 1827. We meet Thomas Bilder, and if we thought that Mr. Swales had an impenetrable accent, if we thought that Van Helsing had a curious amount of affectation in his reported dialogue, well, let's get to Thomas Bilder, shall we? He is the zoo employee who is interviewed. He offers a perspective on the animalistic nature of human beings, right? Specifically that we respond to the carrot and the stick just as animals do, with predictable consequences. But he then goes on to tell of the visit to the zoo of the figure that we obviously recognize as Dracula. Quote, "Well, sir, it was about 2 hours after feeding yesterday when I first heard any disturbance. I was making up a litter in the monkey house with a young puma which is ill, but then I heard yelping and howling. I killed him straight away. There was Berserker a-tearing like a mad thing at the bars as if he wanted out. There wasn't much people about that day, and close at hand there was only one man, a tall, thin chap with a hook nose and a pointed beard and a few white hairs running through it. He had a hard, cold look and red eyes, and I took to sort of mislike to him, for it seemed as if it was him that they was irritated at. He had white kid gloves on his hands, and he pointed out the animals to me, and he says, 'Keeper, these wolves seem upset at something.' 'Maybe it's you,' says I, for I did not like the airs he gave himself. He didn't get angry as I hoped he would, but he smiled, a kind of insolent smile with a mouthful of white, sharp teeth. 'Oh no, they wouldn't like me,' he says." So what do we see here? What can we learn from this account of this mysterious figure, all hook nose and black beard, right? Well, clearly, Dracula is looking younger. I think that's the first thing that strikes us, right? When Harker meets him in Transylvania, he is white-haired. When he then sees him again after he has gorged on blood, right before he tries to brain him with the shovel, his hair is gray. And now here, black shot through with a few white hairs. He is clearly more youthful than he has ever been. We can note, too, the white kid leather gloves that he is wearing, presumably to hide his distinctive hands, right? To hide his hairy palms and sharpened fingernails there. But what is more interesting, I think, about this is proof of Dracula's success in absentia. Because what Mr. Builder fails to point out is that Dracula is a foreigner. He does not note that he is strange. He does not note that his speech in any way conveys anything specific or unusual about Dracula, right? All of Dracula's concerns back in Transylvania that he confided to Jonathan Harker have apparently been allayed. He now is confident enough that he can pass unnoticed, even in the heart of London itself, even in the heart of Regent's Park itself. That, at least, has been a triumph for him. Most of this account, though, relates to the unsettled wolf in the enclosure, Berserker by name, which calls to mind, of course, Dracula's account to Jonathan in Transylvania of the Norsemen coming howling out of the north, right? They're berserkers. Well, here we have a great wolf, also called Berserker. That night, Berserker vanishes from his cage, which has been torn open mysteriously. And Mr. Builder gives us a short account here of the Victorian mind at work. Let me call this up. This is a short little excerpt here, but I just had to include it. Quote, "Wolves is fine things in a storybook, and I dare say when you get them in packs and does to be chivying something that's more afeard than they is, they can make a devil of a noise and chop it up, whatever it is. But Lord bless you, in real life, a wolf is only a low creature, not half so clever or bold as a good dog, and not half a quarter so much fighting him. This one ain't been used to fighting or even to providing for himself, and more like he's somewhere around the park hiding and a shivering of, and if he thinks at all, wondering where he might get his breakfast from, or maybe he's got down some area and is in a coal cellar." Wolves, less than dogs. It's clear to the civilized Victorian mind. Now, we might expect something else from a guy whose main source of employment is in the zoo, right? We might expect a certain respect here for the animals, but instead, no, we see civility, we see tameness, we see this enculturation as admirable, and the wildness of the wolf actually nothing special. Yeah, sure, they're out in packs, they're out in the wilderness, they're chivying something that is less powerful than they are. Yeah, okay, they're going to be like a threat, sure, big deal, but not half as good as a dog, right? And not half a quarter as much of a fight that is in a dog. Dogs, of course, which have in large numbers been bred to fight, been bred for their aggression, been bred for specific purpose. And also, there's the dramatic irony here that he is, to some extent at least, misreading Berserker, though of course when Berserker returns and he sees how wounded the dog is, right? The glass fragments in his head, which we'll explain away in just a few pages' time, he does soften somewhat. I think that Mr. Builder is a fascinating character, an uneducated character, but for all of his lack of education, he serves as a really interesting halfway house, right? I think we could go much deeper into this had we but more Mr. Builder in the book. If we could really get inside his head, I think he would serve as a really interesting point of mediation between the common folk of Romania and everybody else in the book, right? Because he has the great kind of virtue of the common man as Stoker sees it. He's kind of closer to the earth. He's closer to the old things. He's got less of this rationalism about him, right? He still believes in rationalism. He still believes in the great work of the Victorian project, but he hasn't insulated himself away from the real world as much as Seward has, or as much as Arthur has, or, well, I guess Quincy Morris actually, now that I say this out loud, actually kind of occupies a similar space himself, right? Being not unlike the common man of Romania, but also connected to, like, in the same continuum as Arthur and the others. We'll talk a little more about Quincy Morris, in fact, before we're done tonight. So Stoker here is again doubling down on creating this tension, on reinforcing this tension between intelligence and rationality. Sometimes the most intelligent thing to do is to believe the impossible. And sometimes the most foolish thing to do is to discount the evidence that's right there in front of you. The most rational thing to do might be to discount the evidence that is right there in front of you. Intelligence and rationality both are required. I'll note two here because it's just, this is the purplest prose that we've had in quite some time. Because Bram Stoker worked as a theatre reviewer for the Dublin Evening Mail in the early part of his career, I wonder how much he is encouraged in his borderline mockery of professional journalists, right? We had the account of the Demeter arriving at Whitby, which is, of course, similarly overblown, similarly florid, similarly overwrought and overwritten. And then here, this is the quote that we get here after Berserker returns bloodied. The journalist writes, quote, "The whole scene was an unutterable mixture of comedy and pathos. The wicked wolf that for half a day had paralyzed London and set all the children in the town shivering in their shoes was there in a sort of penitent mood and was received and petted like a sort of vulpine prodigal son." I mean, it's excellent in its awfulness, I think. The repetition of sort of there, right? That kind of affectation, as I say, kind of, that affectation that can indicate a writer who is deliberately and performatively reaching for some kind of heightened language. It's really good. It's really well written. I honestly wonder how much Stoker got along with the journalists that he spent his time with. From there, though, I'm glancing at the clock, we cut back hard to John Seward, who finally returns to his asylum, and we're kind of going to gloss over this because we're going to talk a little bit more about the Renfield that we get in this week's reading next week, right? We're just going to kind of scan this now so that we can accelerate through the book. But we get two interesting moments from Renfield this week. The first is this unprompted, unanticipated attack on Seward himself. Again, we see Seward the pugilist, right? He's ready to box, he's ready to fight. He gets his right in and lays Renfield out on the floor, tends to his wrist, and only then realizes that Renfield is licking the blood that he spilled from Seward's arm off of the floor of his office, which is pretty terrible, honestly, pretty gross. His zoophagus instinct replaced here by a hemophagus, right? Would that be hematophagus? Hematophagus is mosquitoes. Yes, so a hematophagus instinct here. I know a little bit about mosquitoes because I am one of those lucky few who will attract every mosquito in a quarter mile every time I go outside during the summer months. I'm just constantly, no matter what I do, just constantly being chomped on by mosquitoes. That's how that works out for me. And there's probably a reading here too. Well, perhaps, again, we'll circle back around to this because Stoker is doing something interesting with Christian doctrine. I'm saying that very softly because I don't really mean Christian doctrine. I mean the specifics of kind of Christian mythology, right? To distinguish between those two things. I think we'll circle back around to it, but obviously, right, the consumption of blood itself is very significant in Christian culture, right? You're looking at Jesus at the Last Supper, right? Drink of my blood, and so on and so forth. Well, we'll talk about that next week, perhaps, as we move forward. We then get another great intrusion of the epistolary form here. This is one of my favorites, as Van Helsing telegrams Seward to hurry quickly to Hillingham, but because he doesn't note that Carfax is in Essex, the telegram is delayed by almost a full day, and both Seward and Van Helsing arrive too late. And we have to speculate here. We have to pause for a moment, because this is so architected, right? Spoilers. This is the 17th of September. This is going to be the night that Lucy Westenra is going to meet her match, in effect, right? This is the death of her mother. We're going to start breaking that down in just a moment. But this is the night of all nights. And if not for this telegram going astray, Seward would have been there. Seward would have returned to Hillingham and would have been present. And we can only speculate, I think, about what would have happened had he been there. Would the same sequence of events have unfolded? Would some terrible fate have befallen Seward? I mean, Dracula is displaying a real kind of reluctance to go toe-to-toe with anyone here. He doesn't want to leave any kind of trail that can be followed or any kind of impression on society that can lead to questions, that can replicate the kind of notoriety, the kind of infamy that he dubiously enjoyed back in Transylvania. So I don't know what would have happened if Seward had been present, but it is extremely convenient that this telegram is misaddressed and does not make it to the asylum at Carfax in Essex here. And I wouldn't even necessarily bring this up, except that we have so recently been prompted by the text itself to consider the validity of these messages and missives. Is it possible that Van Helsing, and I'm referring, of course, to last week's letter from Lucy, which clearly was not a letter from Lucy, right? Lucy's letter from Whitby to Mina when she was already safely in, well, not safely as it turns out, but when she was already in Hillingham there. I wonder about the validity of this message. Is it possible? Might we speculate that Van Helsing wrote a perfectly normal telegram that was interrupted on its route to the telegraph office, that was corrected or edited or somehow, replaced by Dracula or an agent thereof? It's possible, and the text doesn't give us anything to really latch onto there, except that the validity of these documents has been called into question. And if not for this one errant telegram, everything would go differently. I don't believe that Dracula would have assaulted Lucy in her home if Seward had been present, right? And certainly if I don't know. We can only speculate about how things would have turned out, because Lucy is, it turns out, home alone, or alone with her servants and her mother, of course, on the night of the 17th, when she is assured by Van Helsing that Seward would be in the next room, even though Seward has not received the telegram. Instead, Lucy is awoken by a bat at her window and a dog or a wolf in the garden. Her mother comes back in to check on her. Interestingly, sweeter than is her wont, as Lucy notes. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Her mother is compelled by some uneasiness to come in and check on her, and then all hell breaks loose. The window blind blew back with the wind that rushed in, and in the aperture of the broken panes there was the head of a great, gaunt, grey wolf. Mother cried out in affright and struggled up to a sitting posture, and clutching wildly at anything that would help her. Amongst other things, she clutched the wreath of flowers that Dr. Van Helsing insisted on my wearing around my neck and tore it away from me. For a second or two she sat up, pointing at the wolf, and there was a strange and horrible gurgling in her throat. Then she fell over, as if struck with lightning, and her head hit my forehead and made me dizzy for a moment or two. The room and all round seemed to spin round. I kept my eyes fixed on the window, but the wolf drew his head back, and a whole myriad of little specks seemed to come blowing in through the broken window, wheeling and circling round like the pillar of dust that travellers describe when there is a simoom in the desert. I tried to stir, but there was some spell upon me, and dear mother's poor body, which seemed to grow cold already, for her dear heart had ceased to beat, weighed me down, and I remembered no more for a while. So this is awful, obviously. This is a terrible, terrible event, and genuinely harrowing, I think, but it's also surprisingly tricky to pin exactly what is happening here. An important thing to note, some people report an incongruity here, that Lucy has previously been reported as being resident on the second floor of the house, and presumably the wolf would have to be extremely large to smash its head through the window of the second floor of the house. But that, crucially, is the house in Whitby. Here, we were never told about the layout of Hillingham, but we might readily assume that it is either a one-story home, which is fairly unusual in England of the time, or that Lucy is at least on the ground floor, the first floor as they have it in England, of course. So I guess I should also say, since we're asterisking things here that people often assert to be true about this sequence, many people, if you go online and you read people's thoughts about Dracula, many people will assume that this is Dracula. That Dracula has once again taken the form of the grey wolf, the grey dog that leapt from the Demeter to the shore, and that this once again is Dracula. It seems absolutely clear that it is not. It seems absolutely clear that it is Berserker, and it seems as though the text gives us sufficient justification for that, right? Why isn't this Dracula? Because of the garlic, right? The garlic prevents, like, he has to go to the zoo and enlist the help, force or recruit the assistance of this great wolf Berserker, because he himself cannot do it. That's why Lucy's been so safe since the garlic flowers have been in place. That timeline too matches up, by the way. This is the night of the 17th, the newspaper clipping, which we may have already forgotten moving through this book at the rate that we're moving through it. That newspaper clipping from the Pall Mall Gazette is from the 18th. It's from the following day after the wolf would have been reported missing. We'll also note the particles in the air here. The little specks seem to come blowing in through the broken window and wheeling and circling around like a pillar of dust that travelers describe when there is a simoom in the desert, right? These specks, these flecks, these motes of dust, very similar to what John Harker experiences in Castle Dracula. The specks of light that resolve themselves into the vampire brides or into the image of the vampire brides, right? We're not sure how much this is physically true and how much this is just representationally true. Certainly he takes it as being borderline physically true. So yes, we're seeing that again here too. And the end of the sequence is just harrowing. I'm surprised, honestly, that more hasn't been done with this in adaptation, right? The window shattered, Lucy's mother dead in her arms, on her body, the dust motes in the room, Lucy passing out, and then coming to. Some time has passed. We don't know exactly how much. The household maids come in. They're appalled to discover what has happened to Mrs. Westenra. They lay the body out on Lucy's bed. Then, because they are upset, Lucy sends them off to the dining room for a restorative glass of wine. And when they don't return, Lucy discovers that they have been drugged with opium, with laudanum, right? That this suffusion of opium and brandy has been added to the sherry wine that they were drinking. Lucy returns to her room, to the body of her mother, to the specks and the wolf howls outside, and she ends her desperate journal entry, right? This is harrowing stuff. This is really, I think, very effective, particularly because it's also the end of the chapter. So we don't know for sure what happened here, but we can pretty freely speculate. Dracula recruits or commands Berserker to break through the window, ridding himself of the garlic that has daunted him over the last 4 days, and then either directly or indirectly drugs the wine. That also seems... There are two common schools of thought here, and I, as is my way, side with the one that is less popular. I side with the one that is more contentious, I think. The first is relatively simple, right? That Dracula, and we're going to be talking a little bit about invitations here and right, Dracula's right to enter a house. We have not yet established how that works in the frame of this text, and we will revisit this when we have that conversation later in the book. We'll kind of try and retroactively fit that proposal, as we might think of it, to the events that we've seen described already in the book. So one school of thought tells us that Dracula has simply infiltrated the household. He appears as a passerby, he appears as a traveling salesman, he appears as a well-wisher, some messenger, something, right? He manages to trick someone, Mrs. Westenra possibly, the maids possibly, into letting him into the house. He learns the layout of the house. He learns about the existence of the opium, right? He has to know that that is there. And then it is his mastery of the wind, which we've obviously seen very deftly demonstrated by his, passage from the Straits of Gibraltar, the Bay of Biscay, right, at least to Whitby Harbor itself. He controls the wind and drives the ship. It is not the hands of the captain of the Demeter on the helm that is doing that. Those hands are keeping the ship going straight, but it is the wind that is directing it around the English Channel and all the way to Whitby, around the reefs and into the harbor to crash onto the shore there, right? So Dracula, we are certain at this point, as has been demonstrated, can control the wind. The wind blows in through the window. The particles appear, these dust motes in the air appear there. When Lucy orders the maids to go and have a glass of wine to calm their nerves, there is this odd moment where in a gust of wind, the door blows suddenly open and then slams suddenly shut. Is that Dracula? Is that the wind here kind of opening and closing the door so that he can hurry into the dining room and poison the sherry? Maybe. I mean, it requires a deftness of touch, right? A kind of artifice in planning, which I guess we do a credit to Dracula in the opening movements, right? You'll remember when Harker tells him that he could have made a solicitor, right? That he's got this ability to plan and to understand everything, all the moving pieces. He plots out his movements very carefully. So maybe. The less popular version of this, the less popular accounting of this, is I think just so much sadder, which is in part why I'm attracted to it. And it is simply that, of course, Mrs. Westenra has fallen under the influence of Dracula, that she is acting in accord with his instructions. And I bring this up, I think there is sufficient textual evidence to support this thesis, right? Beginning with her immediate removal of the garlic flowers the first day after Van Helsing puts them up in Lucy's room. Van Helsing decorates the whole room in the garlic flowers. So confident is he that Lucy is going to be okay that he and Seward both go home to get some rest. And Mrs. Westenra comes in and takes down all of the flowers, thereby exposing Lucy once again to Dracula. But look at what happens in this scene. The laudanum is, of course, Mrs. Westenra's laudanum, right? It has been prescribed by her doctor. We know that for sure. So she knows that it's there and could easily have doctored the bottle of sherry with it. She goes into Lucy's room because she feels some vague disquiet, right? We're kind of even given the nudge that something supernatural is happening here. Something motivates her to take action that isn't completely rational, that isn't completely under her control. And she is present during the assault of Berserker. And what does she do but tear the garland of garlic flowers from Lucy's throat, right? It's great. Berserker can crash his head through the window, and then the wind can blow in, and all of the particulate matter that constitutes Dracula at this point can blow into the room. But how's he going to get close enough to Lucy to feed on her if she's still wearing the garland, except she's not wearing the garland, crucially. It's sad if that's true, right? I can't offer any more textual proof than that, I suppose, but that is my theory. I like that theory. I do understand the desire to keep Mrs. Westenra innocent of all of this. There's also that detail, right, that when she comes in, she is sweeter than is her wont, right? There's almost something artificial in her behavior. There's almost something that is not completely authentic in her behavior toward Lucy. But I will leave that to you guys to argue over in the comments. Again, you can email me, starsandswordspod@gmail.com. Please do get in touch and let me know what you think. So onward then, and again, we'll just put a pin in the whole notion of invitations, and we'll circle back to that in due course. Onward then to chapter 12. And I mentioned that the second half of this book is perhaps less successful than the first half of this book. And I would perhaps argue that we are approaching that rapidly. We lose a lot of our pace with this transition into chapter 12, even though we're not done with Lucy, right? Even though perhaps from a very fair perspective, Lucy's circumstances are more dire than they have ever been. We're not yet moving past her, but we're also not committing fully to the story right now. So we do lose our pace a little bit. Seward and Van Helsing arrive. They break into the house. You will notice here, right? No mention of the broken window, in Seward's account. No mention of a broken window to Lucy's room. No mention of that window, in fact, throughout the rest of this section of the book, which is odd, is very odd. Now, it's possible that it's just, the curtains are closed. Perhaps we don't need to study the broken glass upon the floor, or perhaps there is a more supernatural explanation at work here. They discover Lucy, after finally and painstakingly breaking into the house, they discover Lucy, they tend her with brandy, they rouse the sleeping servants to run a bath, and then they lift Lucy into it as she is, as Seward rather charmingly notes, right, still fully dressed in her nightgown, right, safely clad. Nothing untoward is happening here, you guys, as we lift this young woman into a hot bath. Then as Lucy begins to recover, we perform another transfusion, this time the blood of the very conveniently arriving Quincy Morris, who arrives at the behest of Arthur, who hasn't heard anything for a few days. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of shoe leather here about, the death certificate and talking with Quincy, who figures out that Lucy's actually an awful lot like a mare that he had out on the pampas, which was bitten by a giant vampire. One of those bats. Obviously, that's what a vampire means. That's what a vampire is. Why would I use that word to refer to anything else that could also similarly be draining the blood from the young Miss Westenra? And again, right, we're running into Seward's dogmatic rationalism here, right? We're running into, he has observed the marks on her neck and observed the possibility that those could be proof of exsanguination. And now Quincy Morris is reminding him, yeah, there are those giant bats that will bite the neck and then drain the blood, drink the blood right out. And Seward is resolutely not putting those two thoughts together. He is not connecting those two dots because he's still too caught up in being a good Victorian doctor, a good Victorian gentleman. That will change. Let's move on here. The following day, we get Lucy has not been restored to full health by the transfusion. Her sleeping state now seems stronger than her waking state. This is where we introduce this idea that there are now, in effect, two Lucys, right? There is the there is the daytime Lucy and the nighttime Lucy. There is the waking Lucy and the sleeping Lucy. There is the human Lucy and the inhuman Lucy. We're going to see that continue to manifest as we move through the last part of this chapter. But crucially, right at the moment when Seward concludes his account, they call for Arthur, and Seward concludes his account with the note that tomorrow Lucy will die. And we cut hard out to another brilliant little epistolary flourish from Stoker here. It's just a letter from Mina to Lucy, but it has the ominous parenthetical unopened by her attached to it, which is just fantastic. This is dated the 17th, right? Again, the night of the attack on Hillingham and the death of Mrs. Westenra. Mina brings Lucy up to date on her return to England with Jonathan, his condition, his position at the firm, which is very good, the fact that they now stand to inherit everything from Mr. Hawkins, which is lovely because they're very fond of him and he's sure to live a good long time. What could possibly go wrong? I'm going to pull just the last para here, just because we've been talking a lot about narrative and haven't done a lot of textual analysis in tonight's session, and I really want to call this out because Mina's great, and this is gorgeous. This is the end of her letter here, dated the 17th of September. Quote, Jonathan asks me to send his respectful duty, but I do not think that is good enough from the junior partner of the important firm of Hawkins and Harker, and so, as you love me, and he loves me, and I love you with all the moods and tenses of the verb, I send you simply his love instead. Goodbye, my dearest Lucy, and all blessings on you. Yours, Mina Harker. I adore how playful Mina is while also being, God, the contradiction that she is, right? The modern woman and the good Victorian woman. She's a very attentive and enthusiastic wife, but also this friend to Lucy who can kind of needle her husband a little bit here, right? A junior partner of the important firm of Hawkins and Harker. His respectful duty just isn't good enough, right? Like, what is this formal language that he's using here as though he's signing off a bill of sale or an invoice for payments due, right? That's not what we do. We are a kind of family here. So I love how she marks this and kind of marches through the progression, right? Using this modern perspective, right? This is, again, the modern mind at work. And so, as you love me, and he loves me, and I love you with all the moods and tenses of the verb, I send you simply his love instead, right? It's this transitive property, right? He loves me and I love you, therefore he loves you. That's a very simple kind of bit of emotional geometry that Mina Harker presents here, which I bring to you just because, God, at this part of the book, I think it's really easy to skip over. And it's just, I think, genuinely very lovely. We then get the account, a much less pleasant account from Dr. Patrick Hennessy, a new character, to Seward, dated the 20th of September, concerning the incident of Renfield accosting the men who are removing the crates from Carfax, adjacent to the lunatic asylum there in Essex, shouting, "I'll frustrate them, they shan't rob me, they shan't murder me by inches, I'll fight for my lord and master," right? More Renfield, as I said, we're going to talk about that a little bit next week as we move forward through the rest of the book, but it's interesting to note that things are progressing, right? As Dracula is focused on Lucy and must be almost exclusively focused on Lucy at this point, right? Given the magnitude and complexity of his preparations, whether you believe that it was him who drugged the maids or not, or at least him who drugged the maids directly and personally himself or not, he's obviously primarily focused on Lucy, but the other plots are still bubbling away. Hennessy, we learn, buys the men off with booze and money and sends them on their way. We'll circle back to all of that later, because then we get the note from Mina to Lucy, also ominously unopened, telling her that Mr. Hawkins, who we were so sure just moments ago was going to have a very long and happy life and retire at the grand old age of 75, has somehow died unexpectedly, and that because of this, crucially, Jonathan and Mina have come to London. This letter is dated the 18th of September, 2 days before Hennessy's letter, so we're still kind of folding the timeline. There is no intratextual explanation for why the timeline as it's presented to us is as tangled as it is, right? There's no reassurance from the author of the author's note, right? The author function of the author's note as distinct from Stoker, the author of the novel as a whole. There's no in-text explanation for why this timeline is so unnecessarily tangled, but here it is nonetheless. So we're suddenly back to the 20th with Seward's diary, the real substance of the chapter, the fate, if not final, of Lucy Westenra. This is how we open Seward's account here of the end of Lucy's life. 20th September. Only resolution and habit can let me make an entry tonight. I am too miserable, too low-spirited, too sick of the world and all in it, including life itself, that I would not care if I heard this moment the flapping of the wings of the angel of death. And he has been flapping those grim wings to some purpose of late. Lucy's mother and Arthur's father, and now, let me get on with my work. So obviously the echo there, right? The flapping of wings that Lucy becomes partially cognizant of, right? That this memory that she is able to dredge up a little bit when she is at her strongest. She's aware of the flapping of wings against the window, that she shall not be scared of them because she's going to sleep through the night under the influence of the garlic. And here the flapping of the wings of the angel of death. Lucy's mother has died. Arthur's father, we now learn, has also died. Let's get on with my good work. The men try to rest at the urging of Van Helsing, but as dusk draws in, I will note that gorgeous part too. I simply couldn't pull every little passage that delighted me in this, but the moment that Van Helsing tells Arthur to go and rest by the fire, there was a large fire and there are 2 couches, and we shall go and rest there in sympathy, even if we shall not talk, even if we sleep, is so good. It's such a generous offer, right? It's such a recognition of fellowship, of real genuine camaraderie, right? Of fellow feeling and fellow human condition. I really love that. But the heartsick spirit that runs all the way through this session, this sequence, just cannot be denied. And we eventually find Van Helsing's judgment here. At 6 o'clock, Van Helsing came to relieve me. Arthur had then fallen into a doze, and he mercifully let him sleep on. When he saw Lucy's face, I could hear the hissing indraw of breath, and he said to me in a sharp whisper, "Draw up the blind. I want light." Then he bent down, and with his face almost touching Lucy's, examined her carefully. He removed the flowers and lifted the silk handkerchief from her throat. As he did so, he started back, and I could hear his ejaculation, "Mein Gott!" as it was smothered in his throat. I bent over and looked too, and as I noticed, some queer chill came over me. The wounds on her throat had absolutely disappeared. For fully 5 minutes, Van Helsing stood looking at her with his face in its sternest. Then he turned to me and said calmly, "She is dying. It will not be long now. It will be much difference, mark me, whether she dies conscious or in her sleep. Wake that poor boy and let him come and see the last. He trusts us, and we have promised him." Powerful stuff here. The witnessing of, this paradox, right? This supernatural paradox. The fact that the wounds have closed, that Lucy is to all outward sign healthier than she was before, is the indication that the end has come. And we've already discussed a little bit. We've already touched upon the 2 Lucys now which exist, the daytime and the nighttime, the waking and the sleeping. And here, not only does Van Helsing recognize that same duality, but he is mindful of a greater consequence than we have any reason to suspect at this point. It will be much difference, mark me, whether she dies conscious or in her sleep. There is still a battle to be fought. We are still engaged in the struggle against all the devils, right? We are still going to work. We are still doing the thing that we have to do. Lucy moves here between darkness and light, between night and day, between sleep and waking, and her condition, ironically, worsens as it improves. Arthur comes to say farewell, and then we move into this final conflict here, the battle for the soul of Lucy Westenra. So Arthur took her hand and knelt beside her, and she looked her best with all the soft lines matching the angelic beauty of her eyes. Then gradually her eyes closed, and she sank to sleep. For a little bit her breast heaved softly, and her breath came and went like a tired child's. And then, insensibly, there came the strange change which I had noticed in the night. Her breathing grew stertorous. The mouth opened, and the pale gums drawn back made the teeth look longer and sharper than ever. In a sort of sleep-waking, vague, unconscious way, she opened her eyes, which were now dull and hard at once, and said in a soft, voluptuous voice, such as I had never heard from her lips, "Arthur, oh my love, I am so glad you have come. Kiss me." Arthur bent eagerly over to kiss her, but at that instant Van Helsing, who, like me, had been startled by her voice, swooped upon him, and catching him by the neck with both hands, dragged him back with a fury of strength which I never thought he could have possessed, and actually hurled him almost across the room. "Not for your life," he said, "not for your living soul and hers!" And he stood between them like a lion at bay. This is the battle, right? We see here a transformation which is more familiar to us, of course, more immediately identifiable to us than it would be to anyone in the room, presumably Van Helsing included, because we've seen the Vampire Brides, We recognize this dangerous, seductive, tempting voluptuousness. We recognize this sensual power at work because we have seen it before levied against Jonathan Harker. There's an interesting commonality here too, that of course when the vampire brides are descending upon Harker, it is Dracula who catches the fair-haired one by the throat, if you remember that moment from much earlier in the book. And here instead, it is Van Helsing who goes for the neck, right? A warrior on the side of light rather than on the side of darkness here. It's powerful, of course. The kiss, the blood, the carnality and sensuality of this, the crossing of a line here of Victorian decency, right? Lucy is flighty and girlish and not as respectable as Mina Harker is, even though her family, of course, is much more respectable than that of Mina Harker. Lucy has no need of work, right? So she is part of that higher social tier, that higher social order here. But for all that she is flighty and less decent than Mina, she is still a decent Victorian girl. She is still, a good woman who embodies the virtues of that Victorian femininity. But this is very different. Arthur, oh my love, I am so glad you have come. Kiss me. Just a straight up, let's get down to business. Let's make out right now. And that carnality doesn't work, right? How can I communicate this? Does Arthur kiss Lucy because he is under the sway of something, or because he loves her as ardently as he apparently does? Well, he does love her ardently, but she's been on her deathbed for the better part of a couple days now, and what we get is Arthur bent eagerly over to kiss her, right? It seems as though he is being affected by, well, that same temptation that Jonathan experienced back with the vampire brides. Glancing nervously at the clock here, we should move in, though, to this resolution, right? Having drawn this line, now standing between them like a lion at bay, as the prose tells us, Van Helsing has set the boundaries. He's laid the field for the battle for Lucy's soul. Not just Lucy's soul, in fact, not for your living soul and hers, which might lead us to speculate what the hell would happen to Arthur if he kissed Lucy right then, right? If it was more than simply a kiss, if it was something innately vampiric, if it was more like the kiss that Jonathan is tempted with in Castle Dracula, what would have happened to him? Would he too have fallen under the sway of this well, what exactly is it even, right? Like, what is the nature of vampirism? Is it some kind of demonic possession? Is it some kind of living undeath? Is it, we'll get into that as we move forward too. But this is crucially a battle that is both won and lost. Yes, Lucy dies, but she dies on her own terms. And it's very important to look at this because, spoilers, I mean, literally everybody knows this, but though this is the end of Lucy Westenra, we are not yet done with Lucy Westenra. Quote, I kept my eyes fixed on Lucy, as did Van Helsing, and we saw a spasm as a rage flit like a shadow over her face, the sharp teeth champed together. Then her eyes closed, and she breathed heavily. Very shortly after, she opened her eyes in all their softness, and putting out her poor, pale, thin hand, took Van Helsing's great brown one. Drawing it close to her, she kissed it. My true friend, she said in a faint voice, but with untellable pathos. My true friend and his. Oh, guard him, and give me peace. I swear it, he said solemnly, kneeling beside her and holding up his hand as one who registers an oath. Then he turned to Arthur and said to him, Come, my child. Take her hand in yours and kiss her on the forehead, and only once. This is a kind of redemption. This is a kind of salvation, perhaps would be a stronger word here. Lucy clearly understands both the stakes that she is facing right now. Well, both, I say, and then immediately list three things. The stakes that she is facing right now, Van Helsing's intervention, and the fact that it is not over. Oh, guard him and give me peace. Well, come back to that in next week's reading. But it is important, I think, to recognize that Lucy here dies in the light. She dies waking. She dies human. Everything that we're seeing here leads us to believe that that is true, that the battle that has been fought has been, in some sense, won, even though we don't even know what that means. We don't really know for sure what that means. Seward, certainly, from his perspective, doesn't really know what that means. And so, Arthur kisses Lucy on the forehead. Their eyes meet, but not their lips. A lovely line from Stoker. Again, I cannot commend enough his skillful facility with language here, and his ability to write these very emotional moments with just the barest of sketches. It's really beautifully done. And Lucy dies. Seward offers a pair of lines from Thomas Hood's poem The Deathbed, I'm going to say significantly better poem than Sigrid Sassoon's poem of the same name. Is Sigrid Sassoon's poem of the same name much more ambitious? Yes. Is it also worse? Yes. I think that's fair to say. Email me starsandswords@gmail.com if you have a differing opinion. And we'll talk about it. I promise we'll talk about it passionately. I do not care for the poetry of Sigrid Sassoon. I know that that's borderline heretical, but here we are. This is the poem, though, by Thomas Hood, written sometime between 1825 and like 1845, right? We're not at all sure when Hood wrote this because it wasn't published until a collected edition much, much later after his death. But this is the poem. We watched her breathing through the night, her breathing soft and low, as in her breast the wave of life kept heaving to and fro. So silently we seemed to speak, and so slowly moved about, as we had lent her half our powers to eke her living out. Our very hopes belied our fears our hopes belied. We thought her dying when she slept, and sleeping when she died. For when the morn came dim and sad and chill with early showers, her quiet eyelids closed, she had another morn than ours. Which I think is very simple, yes, but incredibly powerful and incredibly true, I think, to that experience of grief, right? The act of giving vigil, which isn't not what is happening in this room, right? For all of the like heightened and dramatic and vampire story power of the battle for Lucy's soul, there's also just a simple attention that ought to be paid, right? A presence that ought to be given. Half our powers to eke her living out, right? Which of course is literally true. This is why this is such a great inclusion by Stoker at this point in the book, because it is literally true. Every man present has given his blood to keep Lucy alive. It literally half our powers to eke her living out, right? That eke to suggest that it's never going to be a resolution. It's never going to be a cure. It's only ever going to be a prolonging of this state of imminence. Also, we'll note as in her breast, the wave of life kept heaving to and fro, right? Might call to mind the echo of the Demeter there. Our very hopes belied our fears our hopes belied, right? Not just, of course, this contrast between sleeping and death, this complex, mutable, changeable, ambiguous state between sleep and death. Not a violent suddenness, not even a tragic suddenness like the death of Lucy's mother, but something here that is softer and harder to pin down and therefore kind of harder to navigate too, right? But also this clash between hope and fear, yes, but also rationality and intelligence, right? The modern world and the pagan world. Our very hopes belied our fears our hopes belied. And then finally the half pun here, I wouldn't even I wouldn't even necessarily lean too hard on the idea that it is a pun. It is a word with a homophonic meaning. I perhaps won't go any further than that. Her quiet eyelids closed, she had another morn than ours. We, of course, are facing the mourning of the world and our own mourning. She has another morn. She has, whatever day comes next for her in the kingdom of God, or, whatever religious afterlife awaits her, this dying girl. So I think this is a really beautiful choice and an overlooked poem and a really powerful one. But it is kind of appended with this ominous note from Van Helsing as he observes that this is not, in fact, the end, but merely the beginning. And that's the end of chapter 12. That's the end of tonight's reading. I've made pretty good time. I'm feeling pretty proud about this. That's an hour and 20 minutes. That's not so bad. Thank you all so much for listening to Stars and Swords. We are now basically, bar a rounding error, halfway through the novel Dracula. And as I said at the beginning of tonight's show, the pace from here is going to pick up because we're going to have more shoe leather. You know how tonight in the latter part of the reading we just started doing some procedural work? There's going to be more of that as we move ahead through the book, and a little bit less richness, certainly a little bit less ambiguity. So we're hoping to pick up the pace. I'm thinking 2 or 3 more weeks ought to do it to finish up Dracula, which is important because we have great work ahead of us, and I'm really eager to get to that. Still, though, lots to discuss, and I hope you'll be able to join me next Thursday. This is ridiculous. I'm recording this the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. We're doing this a couple of days early just because of American Thanksgiving this week, but that means that our next regular recording session will be a week on Thursday, or as it's also known, somehow December the 5th. Somehow it's already going to be December the 5th the next time we meet together to discuss Dracula. That doesn't seem possible. What has happened to this year? I mean, I lost October to COVID is what happened to this year, at least in part. But I know it seems like we're racing toward the end of the year. In the meantime, do head on over to patreon.com/nextword, where you can pledge your support and help me keep making podcasts like this one, and not like this one, other podcasts too, but also this one. And also you'll get access to the link for the live broadcast. If you want to come and hang out with me live on YouTube on a Thursday night, if you want to be in the comments right here with me, then please head on over to patreon.com/nextword. You can pledge your support there. You can throw a couple dollars a month my way to help me keep making this thing, or you can just follow that page for free, and that will still get you the link to the live broadcast. So that's the place to go for all of that information. You can find other episodes and show notes over at starsandswords.com. Oh, and I will have, because it's Thanksgiving, the schedule is a little soft, but I will have that bonus episode looking at Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 version of Bram Stoker's Dracula coming out very soon. I have thoughts. That's going to do it for this week. Happy Thanksgiving to all of those who celebrate, you know, coming as everything does this year with a large asterisk, but we're going to continue to fight. We're going to continue to make the best of it. In fact, I'm going to sign off with the words of Dr. Abraham Van Helsing. Of course, what else can I say but this? Devils or no devils or all the devils at once, it matters not. We must fight him all the same. Thanks for listening. Good night.